my presentation. Good afternoon, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased to be invited to this important meeting. I work for, I'm going to be talking very much, taking what our previous two speakers have said already and narrowing it in a little bit to the European perspective. But I think a message that is going to underpin my entire presentation is that really we're living in a much more globalised and joined up world. We're seeing much faster changes in the drug situation in Europe these days, and very much I think we can only understand them in a global perspective, which is why meetings like this are of such particular importance. Let me see if I can make this work. No, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, I work for an organisation called the EMCDDA, and we're a little strange in that we work solely in the realm of information. The EU policy debate, we like to think in Europe, is informed by a balanced perspective and is evidence-based. And as part of a way to support that, the evidence base for policy making, the European Union established an information centre. And our job is not to engage in policy or support or criticise the policies of any of our member states, but provide them with factual and comparable information to support a policy dialogue. We work currently with 28 EU member states. We also work with Turkey as an applicant country and Norway by special arrangement. And really all we're about is trying to understand better, develop a common language to have a factual base for discussions on drug policy. In terms of what we look at, we monitor the whole drug situation. We started off very much looking at the epidemiological measures of drug use. We have 5 key indicators, things like surveys of drug use, deaths, measures of problem drug use. But we also look at supply and market information. And increasingly we're trying to, as the drug situation changes more quickly, we try and develop more rapid responses from monitoring new trends. And as part of that, and I'll be talking about that in a moment, we are responsible for implementing the EU's early warning system on new psychoactive substances. So those are non-controlled substances. And we also very much, because it's very much, we have to look at both sides of the picture, we look at prevention, treatment, harm reduction and social reintegration. These are key aspects of the EU policy. We look at supply reduction activities, and we try and look at best practice and support knowledge exchange. So what's happened in Europe, and what's the big picture if we look at these days? Well, I think the big news really is after 30 years with heroin at centre stage in our drug situation, things are beginning to change. The use of overall most of the old drugs appears to be relatively stable, but we're also seeing a more rapidly moving situation, and we're seeing new drugs, and we're seeing new psychoactive substances, and the stimulants playing a greater role, and medicinal products playing a greater role, and also polydrug use and the co-use of alcohol and drugs being a key policy issue. Well, let's start with the cannabis. It's still the most commonly used drug. 77 million adults in the EU have ever used this substance, 15 million in the last year. But really what we're more interested in is those who are using this drug intensively. If we look at all our measures of episodic use of cannabis, they tend to be trending downwards, so young people are reporting using the drug less. But when we look at those who are using drug on a daily and intensive basis, we find that estimates are not changing so much, and we see particular high prevalence rates amongst young male age cohorts in particular. What's happened is that we've seen increasingly become more aware of cannabis problems developing in the EU. Cannabis is now the second drug most commonly reported in all specialist drug treatment admissions, and the first drug reported amongst new admissions to treatment. And there we see, I think we're looking at very different sorts of treatment options. We're seeing often brief interventions, we're seeing much shorter treatments. We're also seeing some people clearly coming into services with problems through their cannabis use. And that's increasingly how we respond to this kind of drug problems with higher rates of prevalence is becoming increasingly more important policy concern. And what's been the backdrop to that? Well, Sandy has mentioned it already. We've seen a massive move to domestic production within the EU. All countries now report domestic production. And rather than cannabis resin that we used to see moving into Europe from Morocco or from Asia, now we see cannabis grown within our major urban areas. And what's happened here is also it's increasingly more associated with social problems and organised crime involvement. It's a very good way of making money very quickly. So we're increasingly seeing the policing costs of dealing with this kind of drug production rising. And just to say, what's a background to that is we're less now dependent on imported cannabis resin, and more Europe consumes more herbal cannabis, and often that, as I've said already, that cannabis is produced domestically, and it's increasingly of high potency. So we're beginning to see different sorts of public health issues emerging with these changing patterns for consumption with a drug that we know very well. Let's say a few words about the opiates. They remain the most drug responsible for most morbidity and mortality in Europe. But overall, we're seeing, I think, a big decline now in both west and east of Europe. And it started off, I guess, going back the last 10 years or so, we started seeing falls in the number of new use of treatment. Our modelling suggests prevalence probably peaked sometime in the late 90s. We're seeing fewer new clients to treatment. We're seeing ageing treatment cohorts. And we're seeing dramatic declines in injecting drug use. And a lot of attention here has been paid to the role of law enforcement activity in restricting flows of heroin to Europe. But I think whenever I speak to the law enforcement community on this issue, I point out what's happened in terms of drug treatment in Europe. We've seen a massive increase in substitution treatment. We now estimate between half and 3/4 of all problem opiate users are in contact with services. And although some countries' treatment provision is clearly far more limited, what we have seen is a large investment in substitution treatment that's essentially taken a lot of demand out of the marketplace. So it's had both a supply and a demand impact. Against that background, we can see we've seen decreasing heroin seizures, and also we've seen a number of countries now, despite production in Afghanistan going up, reporting acute seizures. Particularly, we have many countries, the heroin market dried up in the period 2010-2011. But if we look back over the last 10 years, we see some countries really the heroin market never really recovering since the Taliban ban and the ban in 2001. We've seen a lot of Nordic countries, heroin being replaced by drugs like fentanyl, drugs like buprenorphine, and we see a decline in the market in other countries. But at the same time, we're seeing replacement drugs coming to the marketplace in our problem drug use market and changing the kind of problems we're facing. We're seeing other opiates coming in, particularly synthetic opiates. We're seeing heroin users in the east of Europe turning to injecting of synthetic catenones, so some of the new psychoactive substances. We're seeing benzodiazepine, often purchased outside the EU, being used by problem drug users. And we're seeing drugs like fentanyl, which is a particular concern. Fentanyl is synthetic opiate. It's about 300 times more potent than morphine. And we see here both in Europe, we're seeing fentanyl being diverted from medical patches, from dermadural patches, but we're also seeing production like this. This is a small production site in Slovakia, but this drug is so powerful, even small production runs can produce large amounts of synthetic opiates. Last week, we produced a warning note from Lisbon on a drug called oxfentanyl. Oxfentanyl is between 1,000 and 10,000 times more potent than morphine. It's being produced in illicit labs in Europe, or it has been found in illicit labs in Europe. It's legal, and it's being sold as a synthetic version of heroin. So this is a kind of changes in the drug production world we're seeing. I think is challenging the way we've looked at drugs in the past, with a general rise with synthetic substances. We've already spoke a little bit about cocaine. Cocaine remains the stimulant drug most commonly used in Europe, but it's followed closely by ecstasy and amphetamines. And what we see if we look at this market, we see if you look at the individual drugs, it's stable or even declining, but increasingly we realise we can't look at the stimulant market in isolation in terms of individual drugs. We have to look at it as a holistic market because users will replace one of these substances for another. And we see, I think, overall more innovation in synthetic drug production in Europe these days. We've seen MDMA, which had in Ecstasy, the drug in Ecstasy had virtually disappeared from the market, is now coming back based on new production techniques. And we're beginning to worry about the emergence of methamphetamine. Again, that seems to be part of a global problem, but it was a drug really we didn't have much experience of in Europe. In the last couple of years, it started becoming more worrying. This is just to show you some of the data from on cocaine. Cocaine is restricted in Europe. High prevalence of use to a small number, about 5 or 6 Western European countries. But all the recent demand data has been showing that the demand has been trending down. So we've seen fall in reports of use, fall in numbers of treatment presentations, and a fall in hospital emergencies and deaths. We've also seen a dramatic fall in the amount of cocaine seized coming into Europe from about 2006. About half in terms of volume now we see it's about half the volume of cocaine we were seizing in Europe. But here I think there's another story. We think there's been changes in the cocaine trafficking routes into Europe, with cocaine now moving through African countries and coming up into the north of Europe. So again, I think a warning not we have to look at these data holistically. Any one data set can be misleading, and certainly I think the dramatic falls we've seen in cocaine seizures aren't reflected in the prevalence data. The ecstasy market is very interesting because about 2008, the European ecstasy market collapsed. Largely, I suspect, due to precursor issues. People in the last few years who reported taking ecstasy were not in fact taking ecstasy, they were taking piperazine, usually MCPP, actually a legal drug, they didn't know it. And correspondingly also the popularity of ecstasy has fallen in that period. Now what we've seen in the last year and a half, 2 years, is really mirroring what we've seen the new synthetic drugs market, is legal precursor chemicals now being imported to Europe, more sophistication in production techniques, and we see ecstasy coming back in high purity onto the market. And again, that seems to be now associated with an uptake in the popularity of this drug. Now that's happened in Europe, but it's also happened in America. I've just come back from Australia, it's happened in Australia. So it seems to be a global phenomenon. And as I say, the amphetamine, we've always had a large amphetamine market. It's been a stimulant of choice in Europe. But in the last couple of years, we've started seeing more worries with methamphetamine. And here, there appears to be a number of different concerns going on. We've always had Pervitin in the Czech Republic. It's been there for going back to pre-communist times. We now see some drift of that out of that into Germany. We see methamphetamine, I think, being produced in some of the Nordic countries, coming up and into the amphetamine market and replacing amphetamine. We see, and very worrying here, in some of the Western countries, reports of new injection and new methamphetamine and stimulant use amongst things like slamming in the UK, which is of high-risk sexual activity and high-risk drug activity. And we also have seen for the first time the emergence of crystal methamphetamine in Turkey and Greece. And that seems to be linked to reduction in North Africa, moving across to, which originally was being exported out of Europe, but now drifting back into the EU. Want me to hurry up? Okay.
1 more minute.
Okay. I'll move on to say a few words very quickly about synthetic drugs, the new synthetic drugs, because I think this is what's really beginning to challenge the way we deal with drug use in Europe in a way that's very difficult for us to come to terms with. We're responsible for something called the EU Early Warning System, which consists of a mechanism for identifying uncontrolled psychoactive substances that may pose a risk to health, similar to those drugs controlled under the conventions. And what you've seen since 2005, we weren't seeing very many of these substances, but now, so far, we've seen about 300. This year, we've had now 63 new synthetic substances notified to us. And increasingly what we saw first with these drugs coming in on the ecstasy market, being sold as a replacement for illicit drugs, but now coming in and being sold as drugs in themselves and products in themselves, and replacing, in some countries, some of the drugs that we're used to dealing with. Let me tell you very quickly about two recent risk assessments, because I think they serve to illustrate the different nature of this problem. Both of them were drugs that emerged for a small time on the European market, responsible for some deaths and then disappeared. Both of them were legal. 4MA was manufactured in illicit labs. It was formerly amphetamine. It was being sold as amphetamine to amphetamine users. It wasn't very effective as amphetamine, but it was more toxic than amphetamine. So you had a drug, people thought they were using a illicit drug. They were in fact using a legal substance, but it was more toxic than the illicit drug it was replacing. 5-IT is a very strange substance. It's a positional isomer of a drug called AMT, and it's very hard to identify if you don't know what you're looking for. We suspect the people selling it didn't even know that they had made 5-IT. We thought they were marketing a product called benzofury, which was meant to contain AMT. It was probably a manufacturing mistake, but again, it was responsible for about 21 deaths that we're aware of. Although this drug is so hard to detect, it could have. We suspect this is an underestimate. Just to show you the sort of issues we're facing with new psychoactive substances at the moment, these were the 4 joint report exercises we launched 2 weeks ago. What happens when we see a certain number of concern that a drug is causing problem in a number of EU member states, we launch a risk assessment exercise, and the idea here is trying to collect some information in a scientific and rational fashion to allow us to assess if it poses a risk to health. And just to give you the 4 substances we're looking at the moment, methamphetamine is a synthetic product based on ketamine, a medicinal product. It was marketed as a bladder-friendly alternative, but it proves not to be. We're looking at AH7921, which is a synthetic opiate that's being used in replacement of heroin. And we're looking at the M-bomb products, which are very powerful hallucinogens, and MDVP, which is a cathinone drug. So these are the kinds of substances we're trying to assess at the moment. So that's my last slide. And really just to rush through that, but what we're seeing at the moment is both on the one side, I think, a fairly static position, but more complicated position in terms of the drugs we're used to addressing in Europe, but at the same time a very rapid and evolving market in synthetics, in stimulants, and in these new synthetic drugs. And this is really proving a policy challenge, and whether you take, I think, a liberal or conservative view, on one side, is it reasonable to put large numbers of substances under the drug control conventions? I know many people here would have problems with that. At the same time, we're also seeing very toxic substances being marketed without any control or testing to consumers who are unaware of what they're consuming. I think that's really part of the policy challenge we face in Europe today. Thank you.
Well, thank you.